Okay. All right, lads. This is just gonna be a quick video because some people were rather curious about what I'm thinking about the new Denia drip teas, of course. And I've been saying for a long time, if you've been watching my video on Denia's paper dolls, that I've been kind of looking into this character in particular. And with this recent drip marketing, I think a lot of my preliminary theories, especially when it comes to Alice in Wonderland, have been correct. I've been saying ever since the beginning of the 3.2 story that there's been a very heavy connotation of Alice in Wonderland, and when we get this drip market, I think that's basically correct, right? So first things first off, we can just kind of look at the design. I think you guys all know what Denia looks like, because, she's in the story already. We can also see, like, her weapon seems very kind of, like, fantastical and almost like, um, it's ornate, right? But it's fantastical but ornate. And there's a couple of things within here that are rather interesting. One, of course, is that there is like this imagery of black holes, and also like kind of like over here, as well as also like kind of like over here under supposedly what I'm assuming is her chain, right? Besides that, we've already kind of like talked about this already, but there's a lot of paper dolls in the design. We've seen this kind of like all throughout the cake, as well as also, I'm assuming that these kind of like things on her wrists are also like human hands or something, because I don't really know what it is other than that, right? And then paper dolls all over her design, I think as well. If you see the animated short of this, there's also paper dolls kind of like trapped within her bubbles, like over here, which is also rather interesting, right? So paper dolls are going to be like basically everywhere. And of course, we don't want to kind of like jump to assumptions too quickly. With, for example, the fact that she is a Department of Void Matter student. So that may be why she has so much links to, for example, black holes. And she's also capable of having a power that creates bubbles that protect against void matter. So I wouldn't jump the gun and say that she is connected to LF1 just yet, but currently there's some things that are really interesting that I want to talk about, primarily when it comes to Alice in Wonderland, right? I have been positing basically ever since I played through Sigurika's story that the white rabbit within the dark side is most likely connected or is basically Denia herself. Maybe a manifestation of her forte or something, but I think that Denia is the trademark Alice in Wonderland character, right? I think we all know that she is kind of attuned to the Fraxidus, and we talked about this within the other video about the symbolism of the paper dolls within the design. So like you can kind of see like paper dolls or like in a hairband, as well as also kind of like around the cake. It's everywhere, right? As well as like within the bubbles that we talked about. These paper dolls are most likely something along the lines of Katashiro, which is a replacement or an effigy you use to contain human sin or negativity or bad human emotions. And that's really what the dark side is all about. So Denia is most likely going to be linked to the dark side, especially because we already know what the 3.2 Segue story is going to be about. And that kind of links towards this idea that dark side hasn't been fixed yet, right? So with that in mind, I've already proposed that Denia is very heavily linked and probably influences, controls the dark side to some extent. But one thing I didn't really talk about because we didn't get this drip marketing, of course, is Alice in Wonderland. Because one of the first achievements you get when you first enter the dark side is Teenager in Wonderland. And that was basically the nail in the coffin for what was really a very obvious reference to Lewis Carroll's books, Alice in Wonderland. And as we said before, this is going to be the premier Alice in Wonderland character, right? Not only is this design language visually already very reminiscent of Alice in Wonderland, with the stage curtains, the golden stars, kind of like this ornate, like almost pastel, like flowery, magical kind of scene. One thing that you're going to see a lot that hasn't been introduced to Denia before is the kind of like motif or the design of chessboards, right? We see the chessboard within the background, and also there's a grid pattern, a chessboard within the cake, right? And the cake itself, of course, like this idea of the tea party, like fantastical, like girlhood, like very Alice in Wonderland, right? But one thing that I've kind of like talked about in a Twitter post, if you want to check it out, is that chessboards are really important towards Alice in Wonderland, particularly the second book, which is Through the Looking Glass. And the reason why chessboards are so important is because Lewis Carroll himself, the author of Alice in Wonderland, structured his entire book off of the moves or a game of chess, right? So it's this idea that basically all of the characters within Alice in Wonderland, the second book at least, are essentially within a grander game of chess. They all make up certain pieces on the board, right? And Alice herself is a pawn who becomes a queen, and there's other characters like, for example, Humpty Dumpty and stuff like that, that also are pawns, are also like, for example, kings and queens. And the whole story actually can be translated into the technical moves of a chess game, right? So we've kind of already established that, the white rabbit with the pink contrails that leaps around, we saw already in 3.2, most likely Denia, but very obviously a reference. The white rabbit, the dark side itself, is a reference to Wonderland. What role does Denia actually play within all of this, right? That's kind of like one of the questions that I was asking myself, and I think there's a couple of options, right? We've already seen throughout this kind of like short over here. I'll just like watch it real quick. We have a very fantastical kind of like image, and of course like Denia has a very like it's like this villainess sort of shit, like. But then besides that, right, one thing I was kind of confused upon is who exactly is Denia, because is she Alice? She could be Alice because Alice's story within the Looking Glass is all about starting off as a pawn on the chessboard and going all the way to the end to become a queen, right? Because if you guys didn't know, in chess, if a pawn manages to reach the other side of the board, you can trade that for a queen, right? I'm assuming most people know that. But besides that, if she's not Alice, right? Because Alice, of course, is the protagonist of the story, she may be someone else, right? Besides just being the White Rabbit, which in the first book was a servant of the King and Queen of Hearts, so basically the antagonist of the story, right? She could be like basically a servant of the Fraxidus, meant to kind of like lure people in. But the other assumption or guess, estimate, whatever, that I have for this is that she actually is the Mad Hatter, right? The Mad Hatter, because one of the things I've talked about in my previous video is that even though it was very obvious that in 3.2, Denia was linked to the Fraxidus and the Grand Architect has been hinting at it for quite a long time already, I don't actually think that Denia is a very willing participant of the schemes of the Fraxis, right? One of the things for that is because, one, we can kind of see here, Denia has a Lahairoi sort of like label next to her character. She is a student. I don't think she's like necessarily like a fabrication like Christopher made her. She seems like, for example, someone who got caught up in the Fraxis' plans because they're blackmailing her or they have some sort of leverage on her, right? We can kind of see already within the 3.2 story, she seems to not be she's not a psychopath, right? She seems to actually care about Sagrika's well-being to a significant enough extent, even though she's very aloof, right? And the reason why I'm saying all this is that basically we're trying to posit this idea that Denia is a morally gray character, right? Obviously, she's linked to Fraxis, but she may not be as evil as a lot of its other members. And that kind of links the Mad Hatter, because the Mad Hatter is a really weird character within Alice in Wonderland and Looking Glass, because the Mad Hatter appears within both books, right? The Mad Hatter is this kind of ambiguous, I guess you could say a little bit of a neutral figure, depending on how you look at it, who is on neither side of the story. Like, they support Alice, but they're also kind of like very cryptic. They're like their own third party, and they're also against the King and Queen of Hearts because they're technically labeled a criminal. But the Mad Hatter, right, is this character who, of course, like wields like a lot of like magics, but also is very cryptic, right? They give Alice a lot of riddles to kind of acquaint her with Wonderland, and they are also someone who provides a very famous kind of like line within the story, which is you can kind of like actually see within one of the tweets I made. Actually, give me a second. All right, if I go to my profile, I like, this is a tweet I made, by the way. So this kind of tweet, this idea that within the story, the Mad Hatter asks Alice, why is a raven like a writing desk? And the reason why the Mad Hatter asks this question is because it's nonsensical. It's not meant to have an answer, right? And it's designed as a lesson for Alice, or the protagonist of the story, that not all questions have answers. You can't chase every lead and basically drive yourself to death, right? And one of the things that's really interesting is that Denia, her quote is, do not watch, do not listen, do not commit to memory, which is very dark side-esque, but then at the end it says, some things are best left unknown, right? Which again is very similar to what the Mad Hatter says, right? This, like, that is really the most famous quote of the Mad Hatter. Why is a raven like a writing desk? It's meant to basically say that, sometimes you can't figure everything out. Sometimes it's best not to find out the answer. And this attitude, right? This very cryptic attitude, how Daniel almost feels like a morally gray character, like a third party that is on neither side, is very aloof, right? Just like the Mad Hatter, and is kind of like shackled by duty and obligation. Because she says she hates duty. Duty is a chain, right? As well as also kind of like the fact that even though she hates this, I feel like she's kind of like, still trapped by duty. Maybe she's trapped by the Fraxis's kind of like mission for her or whatever. The Mad Hatter is the same because the Mad Hatter is actually forever stuck at, I think it was 4 o'clock in the evening or 6 o'clock in the evening, eternally reliving a tea party because he was, if you can read Alice in Wonderland, but the Queen basically sentenced him and gave him punishment. So he's stuck in this eternal loop, right? Of like time. And I think that that really makes it so that basically either Denia is going to be the Mad Hatter, the White Rabbit, or Alice, these three kind of options, or she's going to be much more sort of like general and broad, and she maybe takes on, like inspirations from all of these characters, right? But at the end of the day, it's like we don't know for sure, right? She could be Alice, like maybe within her own story, she is the pawn that goes on the adventure all the way to the very end and becomes a queen. Or she could be like, for example, the White Rabbit or the Mad Hatter, right? The Mad Hatter and the White Rabbit, they're all pawns, right? And one thing I find really interesting is that with this kind of like paper dolls, like this Karashiro, one of the interpretations you can kind of have for this is that maybe like what Daniel sort of like sees with this is that this whole thing happening in Lahairoi is a game, right? Just like how Alice in Wonderland is symbolically just a game, right? Also at the same time, like you can kind of see, maybe this is all a game, and like these paper dolls, right, all represent this kind of idea that all of these people, like Dania included herself, are trapped as players and pawns within this game, right? That is something that has been echoed quite a lot within parodies of Alice in Wonderland, for example. Within the Japanese series Alice in Borderland, that is, of course, a very strong theme, and that it's in itself was referenced in Chisa's story as well, if you guys are kind of like, remember that. But yeah, at the end of the day, we don't really know for sure, but I do find Denia's Dripmarketing is probably like the most interesting that we've seen in a really long time. Chessboards, this kind of like motif of the black hole over here, as well as kind of over here. This kind of idea that like, she has like, it's like these, I'll just call it the Galbrenna hands, right? Like kind of like glowing with the void, and like these fingers I'm assuming are wrapping around her wrist and stuff like that. And then of course you have like all of this, right? Castles, just like castles and fantastical places, like these cakes, like tea parties and stuff like that. It's all super Alice in Wonderland core, but we don't exactly know how it precisely folds into a story, right? So that's kind of like my preliminary impressions. Hopefully you guys found it interesting. And besides that, I'll be kind of like working on a video sooner or later. And then, yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one. Hope you guys have a great rest of the day.